always delayed. And like every interview starts with me saying it's delayed, and then
Okay.
I've actually been starting to use StreamYard instead of Zoom because it's a little bit, I think, a little bit better for kind of YouTubey type stuff, and you can see the comments as well on the interview screen.
Well, when I did a YouTube live stream, I just did it through YouTube.
Right.
YouTube just had its own.
Can you invite people in?
Yeah,
Oh, I
yeah,
didn't know that. I've not
yeah.
given that a go.
No, I just did that like about a week ago, and I couldn't figure out how to set up a live stream through any of the other services.
Yeah.
But YouTube has its own like direct live streaming thing, so that turned out
Oh,
to be quite straightforward actually. But I don't know.
well, I found when I'm using StreamYard, it kind of I mean, I'll definitely give just the standard YouTube one a go, but I found StreamYard's good because it give like you can switch between views at the bottom, so it's really easy kind of interface, and you can like bring up comments on the screen as well, which is good if there's like Q&A and things like that.
Mm.
Anyway, so for those of you who are just kind of flowing in, I'm speaking to Kane. Your channel's called Kane B, and I'll put the link to that in the description. And I came across your channel because I'm in my free time studying philosophy. It's something that interests me. And you've got a really good channel with a load of videos where you basically clearly walk through various topics, various arguments, and you're not particularly partisan. You're just kind of teaching the subject terrain and stuff. So I thought it'd be interesting to have you on to talk about what you're doing and then get your opinion on a few things. So what got you started in kind of doing what you're doing with your channel and YouTube?
Oh, I think it began because I found it useful for learning the topics myself to try to teach them to others. In fact, that's a piece of advice that I think I heard it from John Searle. Like not personally, I just heard him say it
Yeah.
on, you know, an interview one time when he said, you know, if you want to, the only way that you know you really understand something is when you can teach it to others. And I think that's just a general piece of advice that's like out there in the ether. And so that's what I did. I wanted to understand philosophy, and so I thought, right, I'm going to start. I started actually just writing stuff for myself, where it was like I'm just going to write it as if I'm teaching it to other people.
Kind of
And
like
then I
was that
thought,
like the Feynman technique sort of thing of like where you write almost like a question or a topic at the top and then you try and go or
yeah, that kind of thing. Basically, I just thought, right, I'll write these introductions, I'll write these answers to questions, and then I thought I could just upload these somewhere, put them on YouTube. So that's how it started, as far as I recall. And as you say, that's what most of the videos that I do are like that. Most of them are just intended to be introductory videos. I guess they would be aimed at the sort of educated layperson, as it were. But I try to go into a fair amount of detail.
yeah.
Like it's not. Yeah, I try to look at all the different parts of the argument and stuff. So they're not all like that, but that's the backbone of the
Yeah.
channel. Um,
How long does it take you when you put together those videos? Because like you are often stepping through quite a few arguments to some depth. Like I went through all of your philosophy of mind series, and I thought like like you were really going like back in depth on like inverted qualia arguments and things like that. And whereas I was like, if I'd done this myself, I probably would have like stopped at a certain point, and you just like kept going. So does it take you a real, do you just spend a long time putting all that information in, or how did you go about that process?
well, yes, it takes a long time. I mean, it depends on the topic. Some topics you just end up it's surprising. Sometimes you just get a video done and it's very quick, and you write it in a couple of days. But a lot of those videos, there is a very very long process of because you don't. It's not just like writing the video. You got to read the articles, and you got to figure out how like where to put the different parts, and
Yeah.
it can take a long time. And then there's the like just writing the slides and recording it, and it can be a bit frustrating. But yeah, I don't know exactly what the process is in terms of knowing how much to put in. I guess there's because there's always more you can say, right? So with every argument, there's always somewhere else you might take it. There are always other directions you can go, and so I don't know. I just do it based on what seems intuitively like, okay, this is in depth, but it's not boring.
Yeah.
To me personally.
Yeah.
Maybe other people would have different judgments about that. There is always a danger with philosophy that you're just going to start like really splitting hairs and getting pedantic.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are some philosophy debates where it's like, okay, does this really matter? So I try to avoid going that far, but
Yeah.
I don't know. It's difficult to say. I'm not actually, just in general, when it comes to any kind of work that I do, I don't tend to be very I'm not sure what the word would be, reflective about it, in the sense that I don't sort of step back and ask myself broad questions about how it should be structured. I tend to just start writing, and
Yeah.
then
And
stuff
see what
happens.
happens. Yeah.
And I don't understand the process myself. It's awkward because sometimes people ask me for advice, and
Yeah.
like I know that I'm quite good at this. It's just one of my skills. There are plenty of things I'm not good at, but one of the things I do happen to be good at is writing essays, writing videos. And people ask me for advice about it, and I don't know what to tell them, because I don't know how I do it. It just happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe just get started or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your overall relationship to philosophy then? Is it something that you studied as a degree before you kind of got into YouTube, deciding you wanted to teach yourself this? Or is it something you studied in your spare time, then did postgraduate? Or what's your association to it through?
Mm-hmm. So I had an interest in philosophy from the age of maybe about 16. I mean, obviously before then I'd probably thought about some philosophical problems. I remember when I was a kid actually thinking to myself, do other people see green the way I see red?
Right.
To come back
Yeah.
to the inverted qualia. And so I'd obviously thought about those things, but not in any kind of rigorous way. But I think it was probably about 16 when I actually started trying to search serious philosophy myself. Unfortunately, they didn't offer a philosophy course at my school, like at A level or
Right.
anything. So it had to wait until university. But then when I was 18, I got really serious anxiety problems. I started getting panic attacks, and I was having panic attacks like every day. And I mean, I say a panic attack. If anybody viewing this hasn't had a panic attack, they probably don't sort of, it's difficult to communicate how crippling it can be.
Right.
It's an extremely overwhelming physiological response, and it really screwed up my life for quite some time. I wasn't able to go straight to university, and
Yeah.
it was around that time when I started the channel. So I actually was doing it before I started the degree. And I mean, this is one reason why I like wanted to learn this stuff, but because I had this this problem, I couldn't do it in the normal way. That I think was so. Yeah, it was around that time. That was one of the motivations. And then obviously I got better. I did a degree, did a master's. I'm now doing a PhD. I'm in the third and final year of my PhD.
What are you doing your PhD on? What's your
Well, I mean, all my main interest is philosophy of science,
okay?
and within philosophy of science, I'm particularly interested in the scientific realism debate, which uh, is basically scientific realism is, I guess, the common sense sort of view of what science does. A scientific
Right.
realist will say that science provides us with true descriptions of the world. Um,
Right.
uh, the entities and processes that are described in our scientific theories really exist. At least our best theories. Obviously, there are plenty of scientific theories that we know are false, but our best theories, the ones that are really well confirmed, they're just true. On the other hand, an anti-realist will deny this and will have a different interpretation of what science is doing. An anti-realist might say that the function of science is to provide theories that allow us to predict and control what we observe. So,
Right.
you know, uh, we shouldn't believe that like electrons and black holes and so on really exist. They're just useful fictions that allow us to kind of predict and control our observations.
Right.
So that debate has always been the thing that really fascinates me, and that's basically what I'm doing my PhD on. It's what I did my master's dissertation on. It's what I did my dissertation in my BA on. So I've been within this debate for a very long time. Yeah, and well, like I say, in the final year of the PhD now, so who knows what will happen after that.
And are you sort of falling down on a particular side in that discussion, or are you bringing what's your new kind of contribution to knowledge, if you're able to talk about it at all?
Okay, well, there's my actual position, and then there's the position I'm talking about. So
Okay.
my actual position is I'm very strongly on the anti-realist side. More specifically, I'm a certain I'm a very hardcore kind of empiricist, and I guess we can talk about what I mean by that
Sure.
later. But basically, just to give the answer to your question, my view is that scientific theories are basically instruments. They're instruments for allowing us to act in the world and predict observations and to control things and to manipulate things. I don't think that we are justified in treating them as true descriptions. For me, the main thing is that the central argument in favor of realism is going to involve a kind of inference from success to truth. So if you ask yourself, all right, why do I believe that electrons exist, but the Homeric gods don't exist? Well, it looks like the answer is going to have something to do with the fact that our theories which postulate electrons are so successful in so many ways, right? They allow us to successfully predict, successfully make predictions. They allow us to successfully build instruments, right? Like we can build electron microscopes. So we apply the theory in all of these different contexts, and it's successful. And that success is what I think is key to the realist argument, is the move from, we can infer from the success of a theory to the truth of the theory. And it's that step that I reject. I don't think you can make that step from success to truth. So that's why I land on the anti-realist side. So that tells you maybe a little bit about my own position. What I'm actually talking about in my PhD, though, is a view called perspectivism. When you do a PhD, you kind of have to choose a topic that is new and exciting, right? I mean, so yeah, yes, you can put your own views in there, but you can't necessarily just pursue exactly what you believe and exactly the things you're interested in. Like you have to find something new. I mean, certainly if you want to get funding for your PhD, which I did, you have to make it appealing to funding councils. And like you've got to be a bit selective about what you choose.
Panpsychism, here I come.
Right. Well, panpsychism, this is a good example, right? You may well think that panpsychism is a completely ridiculous view, or you may be an identity theorist or a dualist or whatever. But hey, maybe it's a good idea to try to defend panpsychism. So what I'm doing in my PhD is I'm trying to defend a view called perspectivism, just because perspectivism is a very recent addition to the realist debate. And I suppose the intuitive way to state perspectivism is what it tries to say, okay, scientific knowledge is kind of situated in the sense that it's dependent on particular like cultural and historical background, but we can still have justified beliefs about the way the world really works, right? So it tries to say that you get scientific knowledge from like an interaction between humans and the world, right? And so you have perspectival knowledge.
I see.
So it's a kind of realism, but it's a more limited sort of realism.
Yeah, limited to that perspective or that frame almost.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to. I mean, there are lots of questions about whether this is really coherent as a position, because obviously, if you say, well, we can only know the world from this perspective, that maybe looks like you're just going to be committed maybe to a radical form of relativism, like, because if somebody else has got a different perspective, and do they know different facts, or do they know the same facts but they know the same facts in a different way? So it's a new position. It hasn't really been worked out yet, and I'm trying to work it out.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
So I don't know, that maybe wasn't such a good explanation of what it is, but as I say, part of the problem is that it hasn't really been worked out yet, so it's difficult to give a capsule statement. But I guess the key idea is we get knowledge from an interaction between humans and the world, and so, you know, what you don't get with science is this kind of completely objective view from nowhere, as it were. Yeah, so maybe that makes sense.
Well, there's I don't know how familiar you are with the kind of atheism / apologetics sort of back and forth, but there's a popular YouTuber called T-Jump who, one of the things that often comes up in his discussions, and he has some really good and creative arguments that, you know, like a lot of natural theology back and forth can be the same kind of rehashed arguments. And he's got a lot of interesting things that he's thought originally. But one of the things he often goes with when he talks to theists is he's kind of saying, well, you know, you can't make any testable predictions with your kind of God hypothesis, whereas I can with my naturalistic hypothesis. And so it's interesting what you're saying, is because you're someone who would be an atheist, but I'm guessing you wouldn't take that same sort of view if you're not taking the realism about science. That seems kind of almost fundamental to the way that someone like that might be arguing. Is that I don't know.
I mean, there's a few things to say.
There's a lot. Yeah.
So first of all, you said that you talked about making testable predictions with a naturalistic hypothesis, and I'm curious what the naturalistic hypothesis in that case is. But because you know, naturalism can mean all sorts of different things. I'm a little bit skeptical that you're going to make testable predictions from like naturalism as a whole. But so the other thing is obviously science makes plenty of testable predictions, but I'm not going to infer that a theory that makes testable predictions is thereby true. So, for example, the Big Bang model, right? The Big Bang model is a fantastically powerful scientific model. You know, we can apply it to predict and explain a whole host of astronomical phenomena. It makes very powerful predictions. I mean, it made surprising, unexpected predictions, right? Like the prediction of the cosmic microwave background radiation. That was kind of unexpected. You know, it wasn't predicted by other theories. It made this prediction, and then that prediction was confirmed. So yeah, very, very powerful model. But that only tells you something about how the world works, right? Like on a kind of how the underlying like nature of the world is structured, if you assume that it is true. And I'm not going to assume that it's true. I will say, no, this is a very useful instrumental model, but how the universe actually arose is something that is beyond our grasp.
Right.
So I don't want to say that would be an objection to the position that you attribute.
Yeah, because he's
because I'm not sure exactly what
he's
claim
saying
is.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly if we're talking about like comparing, say, a God hypothesis to a scientific hypothesis, I would say actually my objections to the theist, if the theist is treating God as being analogous to a scientific hypothesis, I think the theist actually makes two major mistakes. So the first mistake is the standard argument that would be given, which is, well, this isn't actually a very good explanation. At least if you evaluate it in scientific terms, it doesn't make particularly good it's not something that makes kind of specific quantifiable predictions. I guess it does make some predictions, right?
But it almost explains everything. You know, like whatever would be the case would just be explained by it, because so you can't say what isn't explained by it, because it explains everything almost.
So this is, I mean, I don't know if it necessarily does it explain everything. Like I feel like there are some things that it maybe rules out. Like if there was a universe where it was just like constant suffering and nothing but like
It might be
people
morally
just being
sufficient
tortured,
reasons that you don't.
you know. Yeah,
There's
I mean,
always
you're
the
right.
morally
Like,
sufficient.
so you can make this hypothesis compatible with anything, but um, if you're going to take, say, a particular line on how to solve the problem of evil, then you're going to be committed to more specific claims about how the universe is structured, right? But I mean, so look, the point, I can imagine
Yeah.
some people thinking that this makes testable predictions, and certainly historically, there have been people who have thought you can get to God just by looking at the empirical evidence, right? So okay, maybe you can propose this as an empirical hypothesis, but it's definitely not a very good one. Like I say, maybe there are some predictions there, but they're not specific quantifiable predictions. It's certainly, you know, it's not making any predictions like predicting the exact value of light bending around the sun that you get with general relativity, right? It's not doing anything like that. And if you accept that explanation, then it introduces a whole load of problems, because you've now got all of the problems associated with, you know, what exactly are the properties of God, and you get like you have to work out like the answers to those concerns that maybe the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. You've got to answer those kinds of problems. You've got problems arising from the problem of evil. So it's sort of difficult to, you know, fit, as it were, into a coherent view of the world. I'm not saying it's impossible, but certainly you've got, it introduces problems. And if you just look at the God hypothesis over the whole sort of sweep of human history, it's one that has continually reduced its scope of explanatory, like its explanatory scope. So
I see what you mean. Yeah.
you used to be able to apply it to explain
The
things.
eye, the human eye. Yeah.
But you can't do that anymore, right? So over time, it seems to be kind of degenerative in the sense that its explanatory scope has narrowed. So for all of those sorts of reasons, it's not a very good hypothesis. But the second mistake that's made by the theist is to think that even if this was the best scientific hypothesis we had, you've then got a whole other, like, you've got to make a whole other argument before you get to the conclusion that it's true. Because I'm going to say, well, yeah, okay, fine. This is a very instrumentally powerful hypothesis. You know, there's reason to work with it. There's reason to accept it. There's reason to act as if it were true. But we're not justified in thinking that it's true. There have been plenty of very powerful scientific theories that we now think are false. Newtonian mechanics was, for a time, probably if you go back to like the 18th century or 19th century, it was the most predictably powerful scientific theory they had on the table. And even today, we still use Newtonian mechanics to do things like send probes to Pluto. So like we still use it, but we don't think that it provides us with a true description of the underlying structure of space-time. The claims that Newtonian mechanics makes about like the nature of space and time and gravity and mass and light and the relations that it postulates between them, it's just false. So I would say the same with God.
I was gonna, you know, like what, with this sort of anti-realist view about science, what do you think are kind of, I mean, obviously you're describing our descriptions of reality as sort of tools almost in a sense, but what do you think you know, what is reality fundamentally? Like, why does it follow certain regularities, or why are there kind of mathematical relationships between things like the inverse square law, or so, you know, like on this view, why does it seem to be is it just that we're so deeply fallible that we can never really say, well, we've worked it out, or what, you know, like could you flesh that out for me a little bit?
Well, the answer to the question is basically yes, we don't know.
Okay.
And there might not be a reason, there might not be an explanation, but this is a very reasonable intuition that leads people to realist views, right? Which is, okay, like, how do you explain the predictive success of these theories then, right? Like, clearly there are regularities in the world, as you said, and that raises a question about what it is exactly that's supporting those regularities. And If we have a scientific theory and it's making really powerful predictions, I mean, particularly when you look at theories that say they make novel predictions, right? So some theories are such that we derive a prediction from it, a very surprising prediction from it, before we've actually made the observation, right? So like general relativity, it predicted the value of light bending around the sun. It predicted gravitational redshifting of light. It predicted gravitational waves. It predicts all this stuff that we would otherwise have no reason to expect. That's really deeply counterintuitive. And all of those predictions get confirmed. So that's really striking. You know, it's not like the theory was constructed to fit the observations, because the observations hadn't been made.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I get the intuition there, and that's the main I think one of the main motivations for realism. But no, my answer is, well, we don't know.
So
That may not be a satisfying answer, but remember, Newtonian mechanics also made a bunch of novel predictions, and that turned out to be false. So, you know,
yeah.
I think that
It's that stopping point. It's how, from building the world up outwards, how do you say this is it? This is that final kind of thing. Is that right? You know,
I'm
like
not
we.
sure I follow.
So is it you know, like if we think of the corpus of human knowledge as like this little kind of thing that we're building up and chipping away at, it's how we ever say, well, we've got to the edge, you know, like this really is the stopping point of human knowledge here. This is the true description. You know, you'd almost need some kind of infallibility or omniscience or something to be able to say, this is always true everywhere and for all times, or I don't know if that is.
Well, I don't know if you necessarily need infallibility. Most people who are scientific realists, at least in the philosophy of science, will be fallibilist about it. I mean, they will say, okay, these theories may not be completely true, and they certainly don't give us the whole truth. That's why there's still more work to be done. But they'll say that they are approximately true. So yeah, I mean, my claim is not a claim about like I'm not saying, all right, we haven't got the complete truth. I'm not saying that. I'm saying no, like we literally might just be completely wrong, which is a slightly more extreme position on that. But again, you know, there have been plenty of theories in the past that were successful but completely wrong. And even in modern science, we routinely appeal to idealizations and simplifications and just like outright falsehoods. So somebody might, for example, model a star as being constituted by an ideal gas, where an ideal gas consists of a bunch of dimensionless molecules that have no intermolecular attraction. And there's just nothing like that. Nothing like that actually exists in the world, at least as far as we know. But by modeling the star that way, we can get really good predictions out of it. So, you know, we know there are cases where we have theories and models which are just false, or which contain things that are straightforward falsehoods that have been successful. And, you know, that's one reason why I will resist the move from success to truth, even for the cases where we don't know that the theories are false, even where the theories haven't yet been superseded.
Someone's comment, fluid mechanics is based on Newtonian mechanics and we keep using it. And another one, William Paley thought that empirical evidence can get you to God, but most philosophers thought that you needed a priori and metaphysical reasons to get to God. And I was wondering, with your earlier statement about being a radical empiricist, if it was worth sort of delving into that. So first, I suppose, what you see as the distinction that the person, you know, almost the distinction between the rationalist and the empiricist who wants to, you know, that are there these a priori things, or is it all just sense data that's coming to us, a blank slate? What are your thoughts around that whole discussion, and why do you fall where you fall?
Okay. So yeah, empiricism. I have a very specific way of understanding what empiricism is,
Right. Okay.
and I think that the ways in which empiricism has been defined in the past, or the ways in which it's standardly defined, are not necessarily that helpful. So if you go back to like the early British empiricists, say people like Hume and Locke and so on, then you get this view of empiricism as empiricism is like a commitment to the idea that there are no innate ideas,
Right.
that concepts derived from sense experience, that kind of thing. I definitely wouldn't be an empiricist in that sense. Indeed, I think that's just, I mean, one reason not to be an empiricist in that sense is because you do not want a like general epistemological framework to end up amounting to a straightforward like description of people's psychological capacities or anything like that, because you just open it up to empirical refutation. And some people think that empiricism in that sense has been refuted. When Noam Chomsky, he made some arguments against empiricism. He's talking about that kind of empiricism, and the like appeal to things like that people have like innate structures of grammar or whatever in their head. That looks like a fairly straightforward refutation of that kind of empiricism.
Yeah.
A slightly better way to think about it is to say, okay, we'll say that sense experience is the only source of justification. So people may well have innate ideas, but they just don't provide any justification for people's beliefs or anything along those lines. My own way of thinking about empiricism is that so there's a philosopher called Bas van Frassen who's not really he's not like well known, I guess, he's not well known outside of professional philosophy, but
Okay.
I really like his way of thinking about empiricism. He's also an empiricist, and for him, empiricism is what he calls a stance. So a stance is a kind of attitude or commitment. It's analogous to holding maybe a political stance or a moral stance or something like that. We're not making a descriptive claim about what the world is like.
Right.
And so, for example, we're not going to be committed to the claim that we get that, say, knowledge is that beliefs are justified only on the basis of sense data, because sense data involves a particular claim about how human psychology works. It's a claim about how perception works, which may be false. In fact, which probably is false. There are plenty of problems with sense data. So empiricism as a stance, what it involves is, first of all, a commitment to anti-dogmatism. The empiricist is going to be open to any empirical hypothesis, right? Like we can't just rule out empirical hypotheses a priori, right? Anything might be useful in the construction of science. And so yeah, I mean this is the anti a priori part of it, right? The anti-dogmatism.
Right. Okay.
Just be open to any empirical hypothesis. The second part of it involves a rejection or resistance, maybe, of demands for explanation.
Okay.
And a dissatisfaction with explanations that proceed by like theoretical postulation. So explanations that involve appealing to a world behind the phenomena, as it were.
Why is that? Could you go into that a little bit? Because like, is that like a principle of sufficient reason type thing?
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely involve a rejection of that kind of thing. So, like the way that a lot of philosophers proceed is that they think, we have all of these different discourses, let's say, all of these different practices. There's science, there's morality, there's modality. We talk about things being possible, necessary, contingent, and so on. There's religious language. So there's all of these different discourses, and there's a general tendency among many philosophers to say, okay, what we need to do to show that this discourse is acceptable and useful is to search for truth makers, right? To search for facts in the world, right, that will correspond to the parts of the discourse, right? And so you see this with like moral realists, right? A moral realist is going to say, okay, moral values, moral properties, right? Those things exist in the world, and they're what we refer to when we use terms like good and bad and right and wrong. Or if I say that, if I start talking about counterfactuals or necessity or possibility, again, that corresponds to things in the world. An empiricist, part of the empiricist stance is a resistance to that kind of way of proceeding.
Okay.
But the key point, so part of it is a resistance to that. Part of it is going to involve saying, no, we can account for this discourse without making claims about the structure of the world.
Okay.
But the key thing to bear in mind here is that empiricism, if you look at it in this kind of way, it's an ongoing project, right? It's not simply a straightforward description of the world. It's an attitude which will mean that we have to look at a whole bunch of different topics, and you can have the empiricist attitude to all of these topics, but I mean, you may not be able to solve all of these problems. If you're committed to the empiricist project, then you want to give an empiricist account of science, of mathematics, of morality, of modality.
Right.
But you might not be able to do that.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really matter because it's an ongoing thing. I think actually you can similarly understand like materialism, naturalism as a stance as well, and similarly as being like projects that are ongoing. Because similarly with materialism or physicalism, if you treat that as a straightforward description of the world, you've got a bit of a problem, because what you wouldn't want to say, I mean, presumably a physicalist wouldn't want to say that the world is exactly what is say described by our fundamental sciences, right? Because we know that science is going to change. So a physicalist wouldn't want to say that. On the other hand, if they say something like, well, all there is in the world is what will be described like at the end of science, why should you believe that there's an end of science?
Yeah.
And obviously we have no access to the end of science anyway. So again, if you treat physicalism, materialism as a straightforward description of the world, you've got a similar problem. I think that should similarly be understood as a stance, where that stance would involve something like a commitment to like an attitude of deference to the content of science, and a commitment to like searching for truth makers for parts of our discourse that are scientifically acceptable, or something like that.
Would it be right to say the motivation behind this project is something like so as we don't confuse the map for the territory almost? Because when we have these a priori dogmas in our mind, they can be so far from what's actually out there. Like if we think about something like the ontological argument, for example, where certainly it works within the contents of my own mind, but it doesn't really say anything about reality itself. And is that sort of the motivating factor behind this empiricism, or have I slightly misunderstood some of the things you're saying there?
So I mean, with the ontological argument, I'm not sure what you mean by that, because I don't know in what sense it works within the contents of your mind.
So I guess one of the premises I would, whatever is in the understanding exists in the understanding, or something like that.
Right.
And it's I would see it as a sort of a confusion of our representation of reality mentally and internally, for what we can actually say about the terrain itself out there. Like within the within the mind, I might have a maximally perfect being, but it can't bring it into reality that I can conceive of that mentally almost. That
okay, yeah.
Does that?
No, yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I think that's part of it. So in terms of what like the point is of thinking about empiricism in this way, I mean, part of it is just, well, look, we can look across the history of philosophy, and we can find various people who've held all sorts of different views about what the world is like, but who appear to be embodying something like an empiricist spirit. Like Aristotle seemed to embody an empiricist spirit in his objection to Plato's theory of the forms, say, right? Like you can see that sort of debate going on. And then, much later, obviously Hume and Berkeley and Locke had some actually quite different ideas about what the world is like. But in all of them, there's a certain spirit. And so, I mean, it's more just, all right, what do all of these things have in common? And it seems like what's involved in this stance is anti-dogmatism and resistance to explanations that proceed by finding facts in the world or by attributing particular structures and properties in the world that correspond with successful practices. So and in terms of like why somebody would adopt this position, well, it's I mean it's a bit difficult to say because it's a stance, right? It's not necessarily going to be something that has the same sort of justification as like a straightforward empirical belief. I mean, you're not. Okay. It's like you can say, well, okay, what's the evidence for empiricism? And I'm like, well, that's kind of a weird.
It's an question, a priori.
Right? Given the way that I've just defined it, right? It's a bit odd because what I'm saying is, look, I'm making a commitment to like understand things in a certain way, or I have a certain attitude to things. Like it's a bit weird to ask for evidence of that. I mean, what I can say is, look, you can obviously appeal to arguments, right, that will make this more or less appealing. I've just pointed out that I think there are serious problems with the inference from success to truth. And I think those problems with the inference from success to truth are obvious, or at least they can be made obvious to anybody, no matter what your stance is. If you are a physicalist, say, if you think that we actually do know what the underlying structure of the world is like, or if you're a theist, right? I mean, theists similarly will claim to know what the underlying structure of the world is like. You'd better have an answer to this argument, right? You better have an answer to the objection that I've raised to this inference from success to truth. And there are plenty of people who've come up with, plausible answers to that. I just happen not to accept them, right? Like ultimately, I think they fail. But I'm quite permissive in the sense that I wouldn't say that empiricism is like the only rational attitude. I think you can rationally adopt different attitudes. And that will lead you to have very different ideas about how we should go about justifying beliefs. It will give you very different ideas about, what the world is like and what the function of science is and all of this. So it's a bit difficult to answer the question, but does that make sense? I'm not sure.
I was just thinking that there's a couple of questions that I want to ask you, and then we can go into some questions from the live chat that I've been getting throughout as well. If that sounds okay for time, I think that would take us another like 15-20 minutes or so, if that sounds.
I mean, it's fine. I've got more than enough time.
Okay.
I'm not doing anything later. So
because I wasn't sure if one, as we were coming up to the hour, if that was going to be a cutoff point or anything for you.
Oh no. I mean, I don't know how long these sorts of things usually last, but
it's usually. I mean, the other day I ended up doing a 7-hour stream, but that was a general.
I mean, 7 hours would probably be a bit much. Like
that was definitely too much. I had I've started doing like an open conversation thing where people come in, and then that just got a little bit out of hand for a while with with various people coming in. But yeah, these interviews are generally around the hour mark. Like give or take depending on questions and things.
Okay. Well, so it's up to you. So.
Okay. So yeah, we'll keep going for a bit longer then, and just see where the conversation goes. So something I wanted to ask you about as well is, a lot of these conversations I have are with apologists or atheists as well, and I actually find myself pushing back against both groups in a lot of senses. But you yourself, from what I understand, would describe yourself as an atheist. And there's a lot of discussion about what do terms like atheism or agnosticism mean. is atheism simply a lack of a belief in God, or is the adoption of that, is that a rhetorical device to shift the burden of proof, or as most theists would view it that way, or is agnosticism saying we can't have knowledge, or that simply I'm withholding my and how do you kind of approach the various categories that people might want to put themselves in?
I don't know if it's necessarily that important how we define terms, because like as long as you say how you're defining it, right? I mean, as long as you're
Sure.
explicit
Right.
about what it means. Yeah, if somebody wants to say, okay, I'm an atheist, and by atheism I mean I lack a belief in God,
Yeah.
and like that's it. I don't believe that God does exist. I just lack the belief. I don't know either way, right? So somebody could say something like that. Fine, right? You've
Yeah.
been clear about what the term means. I mean, so in general, right? Like meanings are not things that like exist. It's not like the word atheist like has this meaning that's just existing out there, and we can get it right or wrong. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of convention. I can say that the way that I think it's sensible to understand, the most useful way I think to classify the conceptual space, let's say, is I would say that atheism is the belief that God does not exist. Theism is the belief God does exist, and agnosticism involves suspension of judgment. Um, and that's certainly the way that, as far as I understand, most philosophers of religion use the terms. It's the way that the terms are used by most people, like on the street, like colloquially. If somebody says they're an agnostic, that generally means they don't have an opinion either way about whether or not there's a God. Um, so I'm happy to accept that. There is the so the main alternative definition, I believe, is the idea that we should think of agnosticism as being about knowledge, and atheism theism as being about belief. So the idea would be
Right.
something like, an agnostic theist believes in God but doesn't claim to know that there's a God. An agnostic atheist believes there is no God but doesn't claim to know that there is no God, or something along those lines.
Okay.
The problem with that is that, so the way that we generally think of knowledge, at least in philosophy, and again, I think this corresponds pretty well to how the term is colloquially used, is that it is literally, so it's pretty much just a matter of having justified true belief. And there are problems with that definition. Gettier problems have, but like for most circumstances, we can pretty much go with justified true belief.
Yeah. Sure.
It's justified true belief, or something very much like
Yeah.
justified true belief, right? I guess would be the way to put it. And so whatever position you then hold on the God debate, right? If you believe that there's a God, you're presumably going to believe it's true that there's a God. And surely you'd take yourself to have some sort of justification for that. I mean, maybe there are some people who hold these beliefs just without justification at all, but that I think would be very odd. Certainly atheists, right? Like if an atheist says there is no God, they will generally take themselves to have a justification for that. They will say,
Right.
well, there is no God because it's logically incoherent, because of the paradox of the stone, or there is no God because of the problem of evil, or something along those lines, right? Like you're giving a justification. If you take yourself to have a justified true belief that there is no God, then there is no God. So you're
Would you
not an
say
agnostic.
the lack of belief position though doesn't require justification? Is that
Oh,
something?
sure. And
Yeah.
so the way, I mean, per my classification, if you just lack a belief, that would be a type of agnosticism. But
Okay.
actually, I think it does require a justification. I mean, you can't
Okay.
just, so the point is that you are confronted with people who are making arguments for one
Yeah.
position or
Right.
another, right? You've got to say something about that.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly you can lack a belief because you just don't know the topic, right? I mean, a baby lacks a belief because it just hasn't considered the
Yeah.
reasons for and against it. But if you have engaged in any way in these arguments, um, it just it just isn't enough to say, well, I lack a belief and therefore I don't have justification. Like, of course you have a justification. The reason why you lack a belief is because you think that none of the arguments given by the theists are successful, and none of the arguments given by the positive atheists are successful. I mean, like, my position. So I've said I'm an anti-realist. Yes, that I would say is a type of agnosticism, because
Yeah.
I don't claim that there are no electrons. I just say I don't know. But I have a justification. At least I think I do, right? I've explained a little bit about why I hold the position I do. So no, people that lack a belief do need to give reasons. They do need to have a justification for that.
Right.
Um,
So within that domain, have you ever did you kind of ever grow up religious or anything, considering these questions, or did you just come across them sort of through the course of studying philosophy, and it's like, well, God's one of those things that sort of comes up as a big topic, like why are we here, so forth, and is that yeah, what's your do you have any historic relationship to religion or not?
Not really.
Yeah.
I think I live in a fairly secular place. My parents weren't particularly religious. Obviously, I was aware of religion. I was
Yeah.
aware of God, but I don't know if I mean, okay. So part of the problem here is that I really don't have a very good memory. So
Okay.
I never think about my past. I'm actually very, very sort of episodic. I tend to live in the moment.
Okay.
I don't reflect on my past. I don't tend to think about my future, which is not always a very good personality trait. I'm not good at planning for the future, but because of this, what I'm about to say could just be wrong, right? But
Okay.
as far as I recall, when I was a kid, I just assumed that talk of God and stuff was just a story, and that
Right.
it was like, it was like the Tooth Fairy or Father Christmas. That's how I saw it, as like at least at like the age of 7 or 8. I just thought, okay, this is something like, people are doing this stuff and they're saying this stuff, but it's just like a fiction. And
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so I never had any inclination to believe it myself, and I didn't really think that other people believed it. Like I had to discover that there were people who were like, no, this is
Yeah.
really how the world is. This is how things work. So I think that was a bit of a surprise to me. Uh, um, I mean, in school, I remember we had to do the. You're in the UK,
Yes. Yeah.
so I'm not sure if this is. So when I was a kid in school, we had like these religious songs that we had to sing.
In primary school, yeah.
Yeah,
And
in
I
primary school.
actually I reviewed because I sort of became a Christian, but for various reasons, and I made a conversion video at the time, and I went back and reviewed that the other day, and I did think when I went through like a difficult period in my life, it was sort of, but I think part of what was going on psychologically, if I was to give an explanation, was like almost this thinking of the simplicity and happiness of those kind of times and associating it with some of the
Right.
messages given in like assemblies and things, and that so then as those symbolic themes were coming up again in church and stuff, like kind of going into those psychological states, I think that was a feature, at least amongst a bunch of other stuff going on. But sorry to digress.
No, I get it. I mean, I
Yeah.
have to say, in my case, there was no positive psychological states associated with
Okay.
those times at all. I found it very boring. So yeah, I've never been religious. I didn't really have a lot of exposure to it, and I think that answers your question. Sorry, I can't remember
Yeah,
exactly what
no,
the question was.
yeah, it was it
Oh,
was
how did I come?
mostly,
Yeah, I
yeah.
came to it through philosophy, basically, and you know through those arguments.
And
Um,
is there a particular argument within there that sort of gets you, like a lot of people will say like the contingency argument, for example, and it might be, maybe it's that one for you. Is there a particular thing that you think about as it applies to deism perhaps, or theism, or religion in general, that makes you kind of question your own position, an argument that you find quite convincing, or do you
no,
think most? No.
no, I think they're
Okay.
all really weak. but I acknowledge that part of that is probably a product of the very radical empiricism that I. So like I'm not a realist about science. I'm not a realist about morality. I'm not a realist about modality, causality. I try to account for all of this, like in terms of practical terms. I don't try to think of this as involving like metaphysical properties in the world or anything. So
is this like a Rawtian
kind
God, of position?
Sorry,
is this like a Rawtian kind of position, like a kind of almost like natural selection of ideas or something? Or
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know Rorty really well enough to there are I don't want to claim to be him. But with respect to arguments for God, so there are arguments that I kind of like, right? I like some versions of the ontological argument because it's so brazen. It's a striking, like just aesthetically, it's aesthetically pleasing. Some versions of it, like Anselm's version, Descartes' version, they're lovely. They're lovely little pieces of sophistry, but they are very nice. The modal version I don't really like because that ends up bringing in modal properties, which I have a problem with. That's kind of aesthetically ugly. Cosmological arguments, I mean, well, there's a whole bunch of different versions of those, but no, all of them will. I don't like them at all. I think, again, all of them are going to, if you're appealing to, explanatory power, or say features of explanation or principles of sufficient reason, things like that. I mean, it's things in that general area, like you're using maybe features of causality or so like explanation or reasons to infer something about how the world is. I really have problems with that. Teleological arguments, I'm just not convinced, again, because that tries to treat God as like a scientific hypothesis, and even if it was a good explanation, which it isn't, I wouldn't think it was therefore true. And I also think we have like much better explanations, certainly in the biological case. In the case of something like fine tuning, I simply don't accept that the universe is fine tuned. I would say that the fine tuning is it's a feature of our theories, not of the world. So I can't think of a single argument for God where I thought, okay, this like moves me. It just seems like all of them, given the epistemological stance that I have, all of them have really obvious problems from that point of view. But if you're, if you're a materialist, then I can see why maybe something like the fine-tuning argument might be. But even if you think that the universe is fine-tuned, and even if you think you can't just say, well, it's just chance, like obviously you've got other hypotheses like the multiverse. So I don't know. Like I did express earlier a kind of permissive view of rationality. I said, you don't have to be an empiricist to be rational. Other perspectives are rational. But I don't want, so don't sort of attribute like an anything goes kind of position to me. I think that there are really serious problems with certainly like all of the arguments for God that I'm aware of, and those problems obtain, I think, regardless of what your epistemological stance is. So
obviously you've not spoken to any presuppositional apologists yet. If you ever come across anyone called Darth Dawkins, then he will be able to convince you that God exists already.
Really? Okay. Well, I know I've never Darth Dawkins.
Yes,
interesting name for somebody who's arguing that God does exist, isn't it? No, I've never encountered that person. I don't think it's very likely that I'm going to change my mind about this. I mean, it's just never been part of my life. And
do you think what do you think would change your mind? Do you think anything could, like, do you think it would have to be like a personal experience or something, like or like something to shift the paradigm? Or
there's a couple of ways of interpreting that question.
Yeah.
Because obviously there are things that could change my mind, right? I mean, like I could get a blow to the head which changes my brain structure. And so, I mean, just to be clear, like, I don't mean to imply that religious people are like,
faulty or
have
something.
brain damage. My point is, if I had a blow to the head, it might change my brain structure in such a way that I just am caused to believe in God, right? Like, so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about there. But what you might mean is, well, are there so given the kind of beliefs I have right now, and given the kind of epistemological stance I have right now, is there any kind of reason I could be presented with? Is there any kind of experience I could have that would lead me to believe that God exists? Kind of like how, you might say, well, is there anything that could lead you to believe that there is an elephant in your house right now? Well, obviously, if I go downstairs and I see, a big grey thing with a trunk, and, I believe an elephant's in the house. I can't think of anything. No. I certainly can't, like, I don't know. I can't think of any argument that would be convincing. I can't think of any experiences that would be convincing, because no matter what experiences I have, there's always going to be the alternative hypothesis that this is so. If I was to, see somebody being raised from the dead and perform miracles, and if, like, the stars in the sky rearranged themselves to say, I am God, and then, like, God comes down and he shows me heaven and all of this, there's still going to be the alternative hypothesis. Well, maybe this is just a very powerful being. Maybe it's very powerful, very knowledgeable, very good, but that's not God, right?
Do you have thoughts on the, like, so some Christians will take the position that God has implanted this belief in them. Do you think it, like, so if I suppose if that were true, you just could have the belief implanted in you by the deity in some way or something?
Yeah, that seems like it would be a case similar to the being hit on the head, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm just being caused. Yeah, so if there was a God, presumably, God could just snap his fingers and make me believe in him, and then I would believe in him, right? I would be compelled to. So yeah, I don't know. That seems a really strange position. Why do people? So
Have
I
you
mean,
read
is this
Alvin Plantinga's stuff on epistemology? So he's got 3 books, Warrant
so? Wait a
and
minute. Does Plantinga think that I'm kind of familiar with, the like, his general foundationalist approach, but
yeah.
does he say that, like, God literally implanted these beliefs in us?
So he says you have a sensus divinitatis, and when that is functioning proper, like with the proper functionalism,
Yeah.
according to a design plan in the conditions it was designed for, whatever, he kind of postulates. So he's saying, so when it's functioning, when you are functioning properly according to the design plan and stuff, your sensus divinitatis is almost like this is probably a bad analogy that'll break down, but almost like a kind of antenna that picks up the God belief, the Holy Spirit or whatever, and you begin to. And I think he picks this up from Aquinas and Calvin.
Okay, I think that
And
seems a bit more
but
reasonable.
the reason he says it as well is because, and I think it's this defensive move to, so for Christians who perhaps don't have um justification almost, or can't kind of explain why they believe, he wants to be able to say, well, it doesn't matter kind of how you think they formed the belief or whatever. What's important is that he wants to say it's not the de jure, like these weird philosophy words that come out every so often. It's the de facto issue that matters. And then it's like, so you've got to talk to a philosopher and figure out the de facto issue for
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
how I see it, at least. But
Okay, yeah. So, but that sounds like, I don't know. But when you originally said, planting belief, I just thought that you meant, like, well, it's almost like God. There's like a set of beliefs in somebody's head, and God, files in the belief in God.
well, I
But
think for
it
the
sounds like that.
Calvinist, like
Oh,
people. So
I
yeah,
don't know.
people.
It just
Yeah,
seemed like you could. So that's more like God has structured our minds in such a way that, like, that's more a claim about how we acquire beliefs in general, and one of those beliefs is a belief in God.
Well, I think it depends on
But
people's theology, but I think someone like Plantinga might actually want to say, well, like the point at which this belief gets implanted then is something to do with God's foreknowledge and will and so forth. So and then there's because it's systematically how it fits in with all these other things.
okay.
But yeah, it's reformed epistemology. I think that a lot of people seem to be in philosophy of religion seem to be kind of going down that route more recently. I've noticed, at least. Some questions from the chat then that have come in. So does Kane think we will ever have the ability, tools or viewpoint, to confirm metaphysical truths rather than the pragmatic, if I heard him correctly, truth we have now?
What do you mean by metaphysical truths? But the answer is basically no. We're not. I don't think we have any justified beliefs about the underlying structure and properties of the world. But you might metaphysical truths can mean lots of different things, right? So got to be a bit careful there. But no, I think generally empiricism as a tradition is very resistant to metaphysics.
Right.
You're for an empiricist, right? The way that we learn about the world, right, is through experience, observation, experiment, all of that stuff. It seems that metaphysics is something that it kind of requires that like a priori armchair sort of reasoning. There are people who have tried to develop different approaches to metaphysics. So people like John Dupre, James Ladyman have tried to develop like the idea that you can do metaphysical theorizing on the basis of science. And so we sort of use science as our metaphysical guide. And there are lots of different ways to develop that idea, but all of them rest on like two claims. The first claim is that we can just treat scientific theories as straightforwardly true. Obviously, if you can't treat the theories as straightforwardly true, then you can't use them to do metaphysical theorizing. And the second claim is that philosophy can extend science, so it can like basically do the same thing as science, but just go a bit further. I think both of those claims obviously are very questionable. So yeah, metaphysics in general, there just isn't any way of getting justified beliefs about it, in my view.
And then another question that's come in from his own anti-realism perspective: is there any interaction with Polanyi? And I don't know who or what Polanyi is, so maybe
I think
explain.
he's referring to a philosopher of science. Well, yeah, he was a philosopher of science. Or maybe he was a historian of science. I can't remember his exact professional designation, but he was particularly influential on Thomas Kuhn.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
I know that one.
I mean, like not really for me. I haven't really read much. I don't know if I've actually read anything by Polanyi. I may not have actually read anything by him. So he doesn't have any real direct influence. But obviously, the kind of points, some of the points that were raised by people like Kuhn, yeah, definitely play into my position. So the fact that there have been these conceptual revolutions in science, the fact that science does not proceed, there's the sort of traditional view of science where it's just this slow accumulation of knowledge, like you just build up more and more and more knowledge. Whereas
kind of like what I said before with the
yeah. What you actually find is things build up, and then sometimes it's boom, like there's a conceptual revolution, something completely new comes along, a new paradigm. Facts like that, I don't know, that's not a central consideration for me, but that certainly is one that can certainly, I think, provide a good intuitive motivation for adopting an anti-realist position, right? When you look at the history of science and you see, okay, there's more going on. We're not just building up and building up and building up. There have been these radical shifts,
right.
And I believe that this kind of view was first proposed by Polanyi, and then sort of developed further by Kuhn. But I could be wrong about that because I don't know Polanyi. And I might actually have just got, I might not be talking about the right person.
Yeah.
Right. It could be some other Polanyi. I don't know.
I'll see if let me see if the person who asked is still in the chat. I'm not sure if they had to go. Yeah, I don't think they asked that question about half an hour ago or so, but hopefully they'll come back in the comments and put it later. So can you ask if he takes a position on false versus less accurate, like in regard to Newtonian mechanics?
Yeah. Well, of course. I think there's a perfectly sensible way in which various theories, various claims about the world can be more or less accurate. If I say that I am 5'6", that's nearly true. Actually, I'm not exactly 5'6". I'm a bit closer to 5'7". I think I'm slightly over 5'6.5". Right. So there you've got a sense in which, all right, this isn't perfectly true. It's not perfectly precise, but it's nearly true. It would be a bit weird if I was to say I'm 5'6". It would be a bit weird for somebody to say no, that's false. No, my position as an anti-realist is, for all we know, our best theories might just be completely false. They might just be false about what they say about the underlying structure of the world. Now, they're not going to be totally false because they do correctly describe various observable regularities. I mean, that's why we accept them, right? You know, they've made predictions, they've provided good explanations, they've unified various observable phenomena. So in that domain, they can be approximately true, but they may, for all we know, just be false. I think Newtonian mechanics, in terms of its description of the underlying structure of space and time and light and all that, I think it's just false. It doesn't seem to. I think it would be a bit weird to say that's approximately true. Similarly, if I talk about ideal gases and if I model a star as an ideal gas, that's not approximately true of the underlying molecular, like of the molecules. You know, it's not approximate. So to say that there is a dimensionless molecule, that's not an approximately true description of anything.
Right.
So yeah, I do make a distinction between false and less accurate, and the anti-realism is, it's about falsehood.
So what does Kane think about falsifiable hypotheses? Is his belief about God of that sort? Is that worrying at all? So I think what the question means there just is like, so if it's kind of unfalsifiable, your position, if there's nothing that would reduce your confidence in the claim God does not exist, is that an issue for your view? Perhaps is what the question is getting at.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, so I'm not really sure how to answer that because I'm not sure I'm interpreting it correctly. So the concern is supposed to be that, all right, I hold the position that God does not exist. I mean, I should actually just clarify. I'm an atheist about like the God of the philosophers, as it were. But if you just want to say that there's like a creator of the universe or something vague like that, then I'm just agnostic. But okay, the position that God does not exist, that nothing could make me believe that God exists. I don't see why that's a problem. I mean, I'm not proposing this. Like, falsifiability is very important, say, in the context of scientific research. But like, I'm not proposing this as a scientific hypothesis. The reason why it's important in that context is because we need there to be hypotheses that are testable against the empirical evidence. I'm not making that sort of claim, so I'm just not sure. Maybe I'm missing something here.
So I guess it's like so, and this isn't a comparison, by the way, but I'll talk to flat earthers or young Earth creationists, and about the evidence, and they'll say something like like that there isn't any.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
I've just thought of something.
Okay.
Right. Part of the issue here is, So I do not actually claim that nothing could compel me to change my mind. If or maybe I did say that, but I was speaking in a sloppy way. What I would claim is that I can't think of anything that would.
Right.
So I mean, that's just an important caveat, right? Like you
Yeah,
asked
yeah.
you asked me if I could think of anything that would change my mind. The honest answer is no. I certainly don't think empirical evidence could, just because that always leaves open alternative hypotheses. But like, and I certainly can't think of any other type of argument that would. But you know, I'm making a prediction about myself which could be wrong there. So sorry, you can
Was
carry
it
on now that I've clarified
there's
that.
a what I think there's a like a wider contextual thing to this question as well. So like there's a thing called street epistemology. If you might not be familiar with it, but basically people who are street epistemologists have conversations with people about beliefs they believe really strongly. So they might talk to like anti-vaxxers or theists or but it's generally it's quite a good position, but it does it relies on having a conversation where you talk with someone. You're kind of like asking questions around what would count as evidence against that position, and trying to get them, because if you just say you're wrong and here's why you're wrong, then a lot of the psychological literature is like people just close down, it becomes aggressive, and they don't
Yeah.
Whereas if you ask people questions in this way, you stay stance neutral, but you get them to consider something that might count against it, maybe. So I think there's a broader kind of idea that you should have like markers of, so say if you're married, what would cause you to stop like trusting your wife and leave, or something like that. Or say if you're I don't know, if you believe in the round earth, then there should be something that would convince you of the, otherwise the almost it's an just a dogma or something, rather than something that's like considered either way. Is that
Yeah. Okay.
does that help explain maybe where the question might be coming from, or give you any further thoughts in your response? I
I don't know. I still don't really see what the issue is for my position. I mean, I don't know, like, if this is kind of supposed to be an objection or something. With respect to the idea of dogmatism, I would point out, like, I'm I'm totally open to the idea of God as an empirical hypothesis. Like, I can totally imagine a set of observations we could make that would lead me to say, okay, that's the best model we have for the creation of the universe. Well, I say I can totally imagine it. It's actually quite difficult for me to imagine it, but I guess I have some sort of, I can kind of see how that might happen. But so I would say that that's the anti-dogmatic element. Like, if you're thinking of this as an empirical hypothesis, then yes, I'm open to accepting it in the sense in which I would accept any empirical hypothesis, which is to treat it as an instrumental tool. I suppose beyond that, I mean, it would have to require radical changes in my like general epistemological stance, my beliefs about the way the world is, maybe even my thoughts about what counts as like good inference.
Right.
So given the position I hold right now, I don't think that I can't think of any way in which I would come to believe in God. But I don't see why that's a problem. I mean, it just means that I don't think there's going to be a good justification for that claim.
So the next question then is, I think you might have addressed this, but would Kane agree that the failure of theistic arguments to prove theism meets the burden of proof for an atheist or agnostic?
So the failure of theistic arguments to prove theism would definitely not be enough for somebody who says there is no God. You're going to have to give some. You're going to have to do something, right? You're going to have to give some other reasons. So just from the mere fact that somebody has failed to establish that something is true, right? You can't get from just that to the claim that it's false. Is it enough for agnosticism? Well, actually, no, that still wouldn't be enough for agnosticism, because an agnostic is going to have to also say that none of the arguments for atheism work.
Right.
So, yeah, there's further argumentation that's required in order to get to any position there, I think.
And I didn't actually ask you what would you see as like those strongest arguments for atheism? Like, would you go with something like I don't know, like an evil god versus a good god, and you sort of can't weigh them up. How would you argue for atheism? What do you think are the strongest?
So with respect to, and again, bearing in mind, I've only claimed to be an atheist about, the omnipotent, omniscient,
Yeah,
omnibenevolent,
the,
etc. God. Um, I like my position here is, and this is a bit, I don't know, it's a bit like, this is going to sound like crap from the point of view of
okay.
a theist, right? But this is what I take to be the best argument, right? I think that it's simply this. Um, there are no objective moral values. God requires there to be objective moral values because you're attributing an objective moral property to it. So there is no God.
Okay.
Obviously, I can see exactly where theists are going to object to that, and even atheists, right? Like there are
Yeah.
going to be plenty of people who are objectivists about morality, or realists about morality.
Mm.
Um, I have a different account of what, but given the account that I hold of what's going on in moral discourse, I think I can just straightforwardly infer that there is no God. Uh,
Right.
I mean, part of the problem here is because I think that a lot of people would say, well, in a sense, you're kind of getting the order of the arguments the wrong way round, right? Um, like, so I can give reasons for my moral anti-realism and so on. I mean, specifically, I'm a kind of non-cognitivist. I can give reasons for that. But I think a lot of people would feel like, you know, you've got to establish the non-existence of God first, right, before you do that. But the problem is that I've never had any reason at all to take this seriously, like to take the God hypothesis seriously.
Okay.
So it's kind of like how I'd similarly say, well, in the case of like, I don't know, try and think of a good analogy. In the case of Santa Claus, say, I can just sort of say, well, look, actually, no, that's not a good analogy. I can't think of a good analogy. Forget it. But that's the best argument
Yeah.
as far as I'm concerned. It's not an argument that will be best to anybody else, but that's my opinion of what the best argument is. I also think, being a bit more serious though, like if I'm going to sort of take this seriously, and if I was like if I was asked to like do a debate on it or something, and I was
Right.
to say, okay, defend the atheist position, I think that the problem of evil, at least the evidential problem of evil, is quite powerful, at least as like an ad hominem, at least, so for a theist, if you accept that theist perspective, that creates, in my view, some serious problems for them.
Yeah.
Obviously, I would say, I don't. My personal position is the problem of evil doesn't even get off the ground, because that requires us to believe in objective moral properties. It requires us to believe that there are properties of evil, which I don't. But I think that's, you can get a good argument out of that. I also think that there are, it's questionable um, whether the concept of God is actually coherent. I don't know, because you can always do these, like, you can always get around these sorts of problems, but there's just the
Yeah.
logical problems in the concept of omnipotence and omniscience, and so on. It's tricky, I think, to get
Yeah.
around some of those. Um, so yeah, I guess I would make that sort of, I'd take that kind of line.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And so then, as well, I believe Kane mentioned he didn't really learn much about religion until he saw it in the philosophy. In his field, does he see a lot of strong theists?
No. Um, I mean, I work mainly in philosophy of science. Philosophers of science tend to be atheists or agnostics, um, which I think just arises from the fact they tend to be physicalists, materialists.
Right.
Although interestingly, the philosopher of science who's been one of the major influences on me, I mentioned him earlier, Bas van Frassen. He's an extreme empiricist. He's also a Roman Catholic.
Right.
Bas van Frassen he doesn't believe that electrons exist, but he does believe that God exists.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. He's an interesting case.
Interesting. Yeah.
But no, generally in philosophy, most philosophers are atheists. I know if you look at, say, philosophy of mind, the vast majority of them are physicalists. Yeah, in ethics, in just all fields, it tends to be atheist or agnostic. I think the last Phil Papers survey, and so this was like a survey of professional philosophers, which looked at all of the different positions that they hold, and just had a look to see which were the most popular. I think theism was one of the most unpopular. It was like 70% atheism, 11% theism, or something like that. I might be wrong about the numbers, but compared to the other options in the list, it was a very unpopular position. I don't know what the figures would be for philosophy of religion specifically, though. It might be
I
that
think
there's a
it's
lot
higher
more
in there, but yeah, I
I
think
would
it's like
imagine it is.
I think it's like 70 something percent within philosophy of religion, but that
70% theist.
off the top of my head, but yeah, I can't, I might be completely off on that. That was maybe it was a different Phil Papers thingy that I was looking at.
Well,
I
it's an
don't know.
interesting
Yeah.
question, isn't it? Because you might look at that and say, well, the people who are the experts on this stuff actually
Yeah.
find those arguments quite convincing. You know, so I mean, I don't know how much you can conclude from that, but it is
Or how
interesting to
much
look
you
at the
could
range.
say, perhaps they're studying that because they're
Yeah,
into it
I
as
imagine
well.
that would be
Yeah,
that would be another motivation,
be.
right? If you believe in God, you're going to want to defend God, so you're going to be led into philosophy of religion.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So and what is it that you're working on at the minute on your channel as well? What's the current kind of is there a particular topic that you're looking at or planning on doing, or is it just kind of as and when things pop into your mind sort of thing, you'll give it a
I just do things when they pop into my head. I don't generally have this is not like I focus on a topic for a while. I will just do whatever philosophical thing I find interesting at the time. And there's plenty of things that I thought I wasn't particularly interested in, I ended up becoming interested in later. And uh, you know, I think I've got videos now on almost everything. Like I never used to be
yeah.
that interested in, say, political philosophy, but then I started, getting into that. I've got videos on that now, and I don't tend to do these like long series so much anymore. I have done series. I have, like you say, I did a series on philosophy of mind, done series on philosophy of science. But I think now I tend to just, I don't know, I'll find a topic, go through the arguments. Although actually I am working on a series on epistemic relativism. So I don't know when I'm going to get that done. I can never plan these.
Yeah.
I never know when they're going to be finished. But I did actually lie just a minute ago, because I am working, or at least intending to work on a long-term series on epistemic relativism. So that will hopefully come out sometime.
And someone's asked as well, just for those who are just kind of getting their feet wet in philosophy of science, what is it that you would recommend that they read or that they kind of check out to learn about it and start building up their views around or in philosophy of science?
Yeah, I mean, the best place to start, I think, with any philosophy is to pick up just an introductory textbook. Now, that may not be a particularly interesting answer, but that is the right answer, I think. And the reason why that's the right answer is because any field of philosophy is kind of like a long conversation, where you've got like just people writing, 100 years ago, people responding to them, and what will happen if you pick up an article in philosophy of science now, it's going to be making a bunch of assumptions, and it's going to be assuming a whole load of background about what the people before them said, and that's always been the case. If you pick up like an article on philosophy of science 100 years ago, that's going to be making a whole bunch of assumptions, and it's going to be responding to people before them. And so picking up an introductory textbook is the way to go, because that will provide the appropriate context. Now, exactly what you should go for as an introduction, well, it kind of depends on what your specific interests are in science. But for a general introduction to philosophy of science, I found Peter Godfrey Smith's Theory and Reality quite helpful. James Ladyman has an introduction to philosophy. I think it's called Understanding Philosophy of Science. I remember reading that one. I don't know. I don't want to make recommendations, because if you can get these books, like if you can find them for free, then it kind of doesn't matter, right? And there are ways of doing that. But if you're like buying them, some of these books are really expensive. So I would just say, look up introductory textbooks and just get one that's cheap, because that will probably give you, I mean, as long as it's been published by a professional philosopher, it's not going to be terrible, right? So I don't know. Maybe that's not a very interesting answer, but I think that's probably the right one. I guess I could also just plug my Philosophy of Science series. I have a series on philosophy of science. You could type in Kane B Philosophy of Science on YouTube, and that will give you some information about it.
Yeah, and I've put the link to your channel in the description as well for those who want to go and subscribe. So you can do that as well. And obviously, if you're new here, then like and subscribe to my channel. I only need to get above 1,000 subscribers so I can monetize and do super chats, and then I don't care after that. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up around there, but I really appreciate you coming on and doing this, because it was kind of on a whim, just a random email off of, or I commented on one of your videos initially, and you freed up some time to come on, so thanks for that.
No, well, it's no problem. Yeah, that was pretty fun. I mean, hopefully what I said made sense.
I think it did. It did, yeah. I think you've got interesting positions as well, because I think, for example, most people would perhaps assume certain things about, like what you have to believe to, like you're studying philosophy, but you're not motivated by any particular theology or whatever. So they'd go, oh, well, you must be a naturalist. You must believe this and that. And I think your views about...
I'm definitely not. No, yeah. I'm not well, it depends on how you define naturalism, right? That's a very broad term, but I'm certainly not a physicalist or materialist or anything. So no, you do not have to be a physicalist to be an atheist. You can be even more skeptical. You can deny the existence, or at least refrain from believing in the existence of many, many more things.
And are you on Twitter or anything like that for people to check you out, or have you decided your psychological health is more important?
Well, I used to have a Facebook, and the Facebook was hacked by like someone in Japan or something, and they shut the account down, and then ever since then I just haven't bothered. I realized that I wasn't actually doing anything on it, and this was years and years ago. So
yeah,
I have no Facebook, no Twitter. It is.
I mean, it's probably better for you, to be honest, because that stuff's so addictive and quite toxic as well. Like Twitter's so kind of toxic, the kind of conversations and back and forths on that.
Yeah. Although I don't know, maybe like it is used by people to promote themselves. Maybe I should look into it.
Yeah, good. I think it's just it's one of those things where if you watch yourself, you'll notice like the dopamine tendrils like getting in your brain, and it's like you've got to be really disciplined with it. Like, oh, I'm just gonna like go on there once a day or so, and that is the difficult part that I've certainly not figured out. So anyway, yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for coming on, and I'll end the stream.